Audio Jungle.
Awesome. Welcome. And we're so glad you're here. Today we have with us a couple of my colleagues. So we have Porter Jennings-McGarity, who is a community facilitator in the Midwest. And she's helping me with all the behind the scenes stuff and running the chat and letting folks in. Thank you so much, Porter, for your help. And we have Natalie Audage, who is our resources manager. So I am continually going to Natalie to help me find all the resources that I need to help support our communities. So thank you so much, Natalie, for being here. We have Billie-Jo, Grant, and Terri Miller of Sesame, which Billie-Jo, can you just briefly just say a little bit about what your organization does?
Sure. So Sesame is hi everyone, I'm Billie-Jo Grant. Nice to have everybody here today. Sesame is a nonprofit that is dedicated to the prevention of school employee sexual misconduct, abuse, and prevention. So we work to, in various capacities, to prevent school employee sexual misconduct. And we get calls every day from various folks, from survivors to newspaper reporters, to lawyers, to administrators, to parents that are seeking help or support in many different ways, either needing resources or want help with legislation. But we have various duties that come to us on the phone, and we respond to them as essentially the national voice in responding to this issue. And Terri, I'll let Terri add. Terri's the president of Sesame and has been so since the 90s. So I'm going to let her add if I miss anything.
All right, thank you so much, Billie-Jo. I'm so fortunate to have Billie-Jo with us at Sesame. I mean, we have grown exponentially since her arrival. So I'm I just love working with her. But Sesame has been around since the early 90s. The 501c3 was established in 1996. I became a member of the organization in that year. And in 2001, I was handed the leadership role of president and have been serving as president ever since. So been advocating for improved legislation within my own state. That's how I got started. And then, of course, assisting others to do the same in other states. So it's been a long haul. And we are going to just continue. We're the only organization of our kind that narrowly focuses on this form of child sexual abuse by educators. So we're the go-to whenever there's a problem in a school with a child.
Thank you so much, Billie-Jo and Terri. And I'm just dropping in their bios in the chat so you all can take a look and read a little bit more. But Billie-Jo Grant is also a research and evaluation consultant and the CEO of McGrath Training Solution and a faculty member at Cal Poly State University, in addition to her work at Sesame. So thank you both for joining, and we'll come back and learn a little bit more about your work in just a couple minutes. So we're going to start with Natalie sharing a little bit of what the some of her time at the CDC doing this work, and then we'll come back to Billie-Jo and Terri. And I just want to remind you all, go ahead and drop your questions into the chat throughout the talk today. And so we will either ask your questions or we'll call on you and unmute you, and you can share your question with the group. So please feel free, drop your questions in the chat throughout. And we welcome comments and questions in there throughout the conversation. Thank you so much. Okay, Natalie.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alison. And I'm really excited to hear what Terri and Billie-Jo have to share. So before they do, I'm going to just share a resource that is relevant to this topic on preventing child sexual abuse in youth serving organizations, including schools. So I was a fellow at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2003. And when I was there, I worked on a project to identify policies and procedures in youth serving organizations to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse. You probably won't be surprised, but there was very little in the literature at the time. We actually decided to go straight to the source. So we organized an expert meeting where we had some representatives of youth serving organizations that were at the forefront of the work at that time. Again, not a lot, and it was definitely early days and in thinking about this kind of field. We also invited child sexual abuse advocates, researchers, and professionals who provided prevention resources for organizations. And the aim was really to come to consensus on the components of policies and procedures for child sexual abuse prevention. So I co-wrote a report that came out of that meeting, and I'm going to drop it in the chat. It was published in 2007, so I know it's kind of dated. I'm going to give you a little update in a minute. It was called Preventing Child Sexual Abuse Within Youth Serving Organizations, Getting Started on Policies and Procedures. And the strategies were organized into certain areas. I'm going to tell you what they all are, but they were very focused on adults being responsible for child sexual abuse prevention. So in terms of where we're coming from that perspective for the report, we looked at screening and selecting employees and volunteers, guidelines on interactions between individuals, monitoring behavior, ensuring safe environments, responding to inappropriate behavior, breaches in policy, and allegations and suspicions of child sexual abuse, and then also training on child sexual abuse prevention. Since that time, there has been a lot more awareness and work in this area, thank goodness. I found out recently that the CDC is updating this report. I wanted to just give you a heads up. There will be a new version in the spring of 2022. And there are also going to be new resources, including customizable tools and worksheets to help organizations implement prevention policies and procedures. And that will be in the fall of 2022. And I think, all of these should definitely be relevant to schools as well. As long as even one child experiences institutional child sexual abuse, we need to keep working on this issue. But I'm really grateful that the past 2 decades have led to more awareness of the issue and the need for prevention and healing, and work from organizations like Sesame. So important. So I'm really excited to hear what Billie-Jo and Terri will share with us about their work in this area. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Terri and then Billie-Jo. Yeah, if you want to say a little bit about the scope of the problem and or your work with it, you have the floor.
Sure, I can get started with the scope. When I first got into researching school employee sexual misconduct, so the abuse of students by school personnel or by adults, the first question that I had was, well, how often does it happen? And that's usually the first question we get every time somebody calls us is, well, how often does it happen? And unfortunately, even today, years later, now that it's been since I've been researching this area, we still don't have a very good answer. No one collects data on this topic. And even if you go look at the Department of Education, you ask the Office for Civil Rights, you look at a youth crime victimization survey, you look at all the data that we might collect on different things in education, but we don't collect data on how often sexual misconduct happens. And the best data that we have is a survey that was done in the year 2000. So think about that. It's over 20 years old, and it was done with 8th through 11th grade students. And it asked them, did you experience sexual misconduct? And it gave them a whole list of different types of misconduct, which included both contact and non-contact sexual misconduct examples. And then it had the one question that said, by whom? And that is the only survey that we can refer to that actually has that by whom category that was actually done in a generalizable way that we can generalize it to the US population. And that survey said that 1 in 10 students, or 9.6% of students, will experience school employee sexual misconduct by the time they graduate from high school. And
could you say that number one more time?
Yeah, so it's 9.6%. And of that, 6.9% is the contact category, which is more self-explanatory, where the non-contact makes up that other 3 or so percent. And non-contact would be things like showing of pornography or inappropriate communications, things like that. But since then, something that Sesame's been doing is we've been advocating for the collection of this data. And then we've also been collecting the Google alerts. And it seems silly, but unfortunately, because there's not a lot of data out there, we just started logging every time teacher arrested, teacher sexual misconduct, or something comes up in the news, which we know is very much an everyday experience. You've probably seen the headlines out there. So since 2014, we've been documenting those in an Excel database. So every time one of them comes up, we have a line item for that Google alert. And as of right now, we have 3,790 as of the end of last year. So that ranges from about 500 to 700 a year of headlines of sexual misconduct by an educator. And so that's data that we did have an article out in that had looked at the 2014 statistics on those educators that I'd be happy to share. And then we're continuing to analyze that data and get it out there. And oftentimes when reporters call, they say, do you have the number of cases from Colorado or the number of cases from Florida? And we'll go ahead and search the database and send them the results from that state. So it has proved to be pretty valuable. And a new initiative is I'm also collecting the FOIA, doing FOIA requests of all the Department of Educations in every state to ask for their revocations for sexual misconduct from the year 2019. And so that's been an initiative this summer, and I have about 25 states that have responded so far. And those are getting up to the 700-800 revocations for that year, just from those 20 to 25 states, still missing quite a few. And that will also just give us a picture for how often this happens. So another resource that we can share that Alison can send out is a by the number sheet. And that's essentially, there's lots of media folks that collect data on this, anecdotal evidence. And we try and piece that together to show the scope of the problem. But that's the best we can do, given that no government agency is tasked with collecting all this data. So
my first most intuitive question that I'm sure we're all wondering is why is this not being tracked? What's your, you can even say, from a philosophical standpoint, what's your opinion? Why is this not being tracked?
Well, one of the reasons it's not being tracked is in Washington, if the data doesn't exist, the problem doesn't exist. So let's go back to No Child Left Behind. In the original No Child Left Behind, there was a call for a new study and new data to be collected. One of our board of advisors, who has been advising Sesame for more than 2 decades now, Dr. Cheryl Shakeshap, was tasked from the U.S. Department of Education to conduct that research, but they would not allow her to collect new data, because that would have meant the U.S. Department of Education would have had to put in place surveys to be conducted by every state to gather the data, and they didn't want to do it. So they only allowed her to do a study on the existing research. And so that's how we came up with the 2004 report that was put out by the U.S. Department of Education. So again, we've had long conversations with the Office of Civil Rights. They do the Civil Rights Data Collection project. And I have been tracking their survey document for years. And in the document, they describe adults as potential perpetrators of sexual harassment, but they don't ask one question in the survey about those adults. They do, however, ask about how many students have been sexually harassed by other students and how many students have been expelled or had disciplinary actions against them for sexually harassing other students. And that amounts to about 4 different questions in the survey. So we've had conversations with them, and as of our last conversation, they did promise that they would be updating their survey for that civil rights project to include adults in the questionnaire.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that some more, I think, well, why don't people collect data? Again, it's that the fear that what if we find out that 10% of our students that are going to school are being abused, and we're sending our kids off to school for 7 hours a day to go be we trust that they're going to be safe. And that's a big deal when we think about these are our trusted educators that everyone in the US trusts to take care of our kids. And that's beyond even Boy Scouts or the Catholic diocese, where that's a choice that you're sending your kids off to church or you're sending your kids to the Boy Scout. But school is not a choice. It's mandated in the US. And that's, I think it's really scary for our government. It's scary for our parents to think that something like this could happen. And so even though we have this data, it's something that we've applied for funding to have government grants put to this issue, and very little funding gets devoted to this area of research. Much of the research that we have done is just pro bono. It's us doing it because we want to get the word out. That Google Alert database is just Sesame doing that. That's us and a few research students that are helping us along. And same thing with the FOIA, that's coming out of my checkbook. It's just, that is how we're doing this research. And unfortunately, we really need help to get more data. We need more help from the government and from private donors. We need help to get this data out there to people.
Yes. Yes, I challenge everyone that's on this webinar today, just set up for a week. Teacher arrested and educator sexual abuse. Just get a Google alert. You will be astonished at what falls into your Dropbox for those Google alerts. Now, if I click on any one of these, this is just a list of what comes in. But when you click on it, then you get a whole list of all of the arrests that are happening. You see, so each one of these alerts has anywhere from 1 to 20 plus news articles about a teacher somewhere in the world, because these do include some from other countries, but most of them are in the United States, sadly.
Well, I encourage you both to be sure to post a blog, to our website as a follow-up. Definitely, we would encourage you to, if anyone here has resources or wants to connect, but the number one thing that we do at Paces Connection is that we connect people with each other who are focused on this topic. Everyone on this call today, everyone of our 52,000 plus members is dedicated to ending child trauma, because we fully understand the long-term health impacts. Adverse childhood experiences, of which sexual abuse is one, is the number one health indicator of literally every single health outcome you can think of, right? If we're talking about heart disease, depression, substance misuse, both physical and mental illnesses are all tied back to adverse childhood experiences. So please let us know how we can support your work and help connect you with people that can help, because that's exactly what we're all about here. So I encourage you to make a post on our website, or regular posts on our website with updates, reports, requests for volunteers or more resources. And that always seems to happen really easily on our site. Even, we've helped a lot of organizations find funding. So just wanted to let you know that that's all something that we can help with. Our next question is, why is keeping predators away from child-based work so difficult? What makes this so challenging?
Wow, the short answer, well, where children are present, so too are those who are seeking to gain access to them. And that's, as we see, Boy Scouts, amateur sports, church, camp, summer camp. I mean, where children are, that's where predators are also going to be. So our best defense against that is to implement policies, regulations, legislation that is going to call for thorough vetting of people seeking to be working in youth serving organizations and institutions. And that's one of the things Sesame has worked so strongly on is to call for thorough vetting beyond fingerprint background checks, because we know that those folks don't carry, most of them don't carry a criminal history because they're being passed. They're very mobile. They move from one place to another. As soon as they're found out or allegations are made, they're out of there and seeking to find employment or volunteer work elsewhere. So the only way to capture those that have offending histories is to thoroughly vet them when they come in the door seeking employment or volunteer work.
Yeah, one of the, we did mention all the Google alerts, and unfortunately that teacher arrested is just what we call the tip of the iceberg, because those are only the cases that make it to the paper that actually there was an arrest involved. And it's estimated that 95% of cases in this adult sexual misconduct realm never make it to the paper, and they're handled internally. And what Terry's saying, this pass the trash, that nobody wants to be a headline. These school districts, it's a big deal if they're a headline. Nobody wants to have parents calling in. They don't want to be known as the school where that stuff happened. And so they want to do what they can to hide it, to sweep it under the rug. And even if they know personally that, hey, that's probably not a good idea, this person's going to go do it somewhere else, or I'm passing along this lemon or this dirty laundry onto somebody else, they think about it from their own personal gain, that I don't want this on my record as an administrator. I don't want this on a record for my school. I don't want this to have parents calling in about this issue. And so unfortunately, a lot of cases get handled with that sweeping under the rug that, well, let's get rid of you for a small ethical violation instead of actually documenting the sexual misconduct that occurred and actually going to law enforcement and having things blow up in the way that it should have. So by just documenting a small ethical violation, it allows them to get rid of that person. They go get hired somewhere else. But by leaving things in that gray area, then there's no record. So you might think, oh, well, if we do criminal background checks, these people should show up. But all those ethical violations, that gray area, doesn't show up in a background search. And many times those records are sealed, and people are administrators are really afraid to actually disclose information on the phone about what happened because they're worried about that teacher's rights, their teacher protection from the unions. And so they're afraid to share too much, even when they get a phone call from somebody saying so-and-so is trying to get hired over here. So because there's that huge gray area, people don't want to be a headline. They just want to get rid of it. And it makes them, it's a win-win in a lot of ways for the school district and for the parents and for the student. The student doesn't have to be a victim on the witness stand. The parents are happy. Their dirty laundry wasn't aired in the paper. The administrator's happy because they're not a headline, and everybody thinks they're winning, but then that person just goes and does it again in another district. And then they do it again and again. Right. And so it perpetuates the problem by not stopping it right away. So
That's right. And the data does show that one perpetrator in our schools will work in a minimum of 3 school employment settings before they're ever reported and punished, and can have as many as 73 victims in their lifetime. So when you take those 3,000, almost 4,000 Google Alert arrests and multiply each one of those by 73, we have an epidemic of sexual misconduct going on in our schools. And by ignoring it, by passing it, we're deliberately endangering children. When they are aiding and abetting by passing a teacher off with the help of teachers unions, because it's usually the teachers union that will negotiate the separation agreement that places the gag order on administrators from giving negative referrals. So this is where it all gets bound up, and this is what we're trying to prevent. In fact, we were behind the federal legislation that is in the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. It's a prohibition on aiding and abetting sexual abuse in schools. And what it says is that every school that is receiving Title II funding is required to establish policy, regulation, or legislation that prohibits any form of concealment of sexual misconduct. And that means confidentiality agreements should be banned, clauses in collective bargaining contracts that allow for file scrubbing, separation agreements, non-disclosure agreements, all of that kind of concealment is supposed to be prohibited because it is endangering children when they pass them. And we think that too should be dealt with on a criminal level. You know, and right up there with the same kind of endangerment if a parent leaves a child in a hot car or neglects their child, you know, this is child endangerment by passing known predators from one child serving institution to another.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to call on Natalie to also weigh in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that you've just said. And one of the things that I think I just want us to all hold is just that the people that you're talking about have actually been identified as perpetrators. And I think one of the things that really needs to happen for prevention that doesn't happen enough is thinking about how not just in screening and hiring. I mean, the report that I talked about or referenced earlier, that was just the first step. And everybody agreed that was not enough because 90% of perpetrators aren't even ever identified, right? So there's that piece too. So I think things like developing guidelines that are really clear about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate behavior, what's you know, harmful. So, you know, having a continuum, but then also making sure that things like monitoring behavior happens no matter what. It doesn't matter. You know, I know educators are in the rooms, and in a lot of organizations, there is only one adult in the room with children at a time, but that means that there needs to be a lot of monitoring, right? There needs to be drop-ins by people. There also need to be things like a clear reporting structure. But one of the things that that we did highlight was also ensuring safe environments, and that's things like visibility. You know, making sure there's a window in the. I mean, some of it's very simple when you think about it, but like you shouldn't have a door that doesn't have a window, right? So you should always be able to see into a classroom or closets, and I mean things like that where observation happens and nobody is above that, right? Like everybody needs to be assumed to not, you know, be in that position. So I think we need to balance, you know, definitely screening and definitely making sure that when somebody is identified as a perpetrator, all the things that you said, but also making sure that those policies and procedures are in place for everybody who hasn't been caught. And sometimes it might be somebody who, you know, just needs some guidance on what an inappropriate behavior is, like, hey, we're going to stop right there. And it doesn't get to the level, but always knowing that there is a huge continuum and we need to make sure we're addressing things at all levels of it. Does that make sense? I'm trying to...
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Yeah, Terri, did you want to respond? And then I'm going to let Linda share a question.
Yes, Natalie. Oh my goodness. Some of the stories and calls that I have received of late. One was by an elementary school teacher that knows of a high school teacher that has been masturbating at school with fantasies about his female students. He's also been doing the same while he's been Zoom teaching through the pandemic. And she was calling to find out if this was, her question was, is this acceptable behavior and what should I do? Now, this is a teacher. I was, as you probably all are flabbergasted, I was as well, that the fact that a teacher doesn't see that or know definitely that that's inappropriate, and as a mandated reporter, she should immediately report that and turn over any evidence of how she came to this knowledge. Is a clear example of the lack of training and lack of knowledge within the education profession. Some of the other things we're told is that in elementary school, a teacher can be offending a child in the back of a classroom while they put on a film for the rest of the classroom to watch. And certain students would be called to the back of the classroom for the teacher to offend them. And of course, these little children don't comprehend, until much later what's going on. But yeah, these are the things. And so in teacher prep programs, there's very, very little training or education on maintaining proper boundaries, acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, criminal behaviors, luring type of behaviors. And we need more of that from the onset of entering colleges of education.
And I just want to add to what you said that actually addresses Allison's question too. I think if schools and other organizations are really clear about what all those things are from the outset, right, that does hopefully make some of those perpetrators think twice about going into that organization or that school, because they know how serious it is, and here's the reporting, and here's what we're going to do to make sure. But if that's laid out and really upfront, I do hope that is somewhat of a deterrent. So anyway, just to tie in everything. Yeah, I absolutely.
And to bring it back to PACEs, how many of our educators are suffering from adverse childhood experiences and going into this field, untreated. So again, there's, within entering a college of education, maybe there also needs to be a form of screening, to see if this is the right fit, for folks. Much in the same way as military and, police academy candidates, go through, the evaluations, the psychological evaluations and the fitness exams to see if it's a good fit for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Linda had a question. Linda, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You just have to accept the unmute.
Yes, I'm in Washington, D.C., and we have a pretty good network here of people advocating against child sexual abuse. And I'd like more information about what happened to this legislation so we can start advocating to get it passed.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, there was some standalone legislation a few years ago, from 2011 to 2015, when that little portion of the Every Student Succeeds Act went in to effect. There was a standalone bill, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. It passed the House unanimously in, I believe it was 2012 or 13. And then it went over to the Senate side where Senator Pat Toomey and Senator Joe Manchin took it up. And they could never even get a hearing on it. And what the legislation called for was for every state to implement uniform and comprehensive background checks. The fingerprint background checks. Some states were only checking fingerprints against their own state registry. Other states were maybe checking their state plus their neighboring states registry. And then some states were checking their state and then the FBI database. And some states didn't do background checks at all, believe it or not. So it called for these uniform comprehensive background checks. It also called for the prohibition of aiding and abetting, so banning the use of all of these confidentiality agreements. And then it was also calling for a national database to be established where those that had a history of offending and had substantiated offenses, they would be placed on this national database as a hiring tool for schools. So it never could get a hearing in the Senate. It never got a vote on the Senate floor, and after many attempts by Senator Toomey and Manchin. So what they ended up doing was trying to amend it, the whole thing, into ESSA. And the only part that made it in was this prohibition on aiding and abetting. So the confidentiality agreements. But right now, only 11 states have complied with that ESSA provision. 39 states have not. And so the Department of Education has been conducting a study on the state's compliance and non-compliance of this ESSA provision. The final report was supposed to come out this year, but we've recently noticed that the grant has been extended till next year. So perhaps the final report of that study will be coming. We're just waiting. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that update. Billie-Jo, anything?
Yeah, Linda, we'd be happy if you want to email us directly through the Sesame site. We'd be happy to support any legislative updates. We support folks in every state to try and get that passed and supply you with information that you could use to advocate for that in your area, your state. So would be happy to do that.
Thank you. Our next question is, what's working in institutional child abuse prevention?
I think Natalie touched on that a little bit with policies. I do think policy-wise, there's a lot of written stuff already, and that policies are there, they're written down, grievance procedures are there, and I think where Natalie touched on that the gray areas aren't defined very well, those kind of grooming behaviors. Can you give a student a ride home? Can you be in a classroom one-on-one? Can you be friends on social media? All these kind of gray area questions that if we can make more clear, that can help to get rid of those gray areas. But of course, that comes along with having to have accountability and ways to report if folks aren't following those. But the DOJ study that I did a while ago, we went around to 5 districts that had had cases and asked them what was working, what wasn't working. And one of the biggest areas that made a difference was leadership. And having the tone from leadership that this is not acceptable, this is something we don't tolerate, and having a leadership team that just talks about it, that, hey, this is something that can happen in our schools, it's not welcome here, and this is what we're doing about it. And having somebody that's kind of that champion or that leadership sets the tone for the organization. And so beyond policy, I think leadership is a really big part of it. And then leadership that encourages training. And that training is not only for administrators and how to appropriately respond to cases and investigate them appropriately, but that training is also for all school employees. So that's not just the teachers, that's also the janitors and the bus drivers and the secretaries, about what sexual harassment looks like, how to recognize it, and how to make a report. So it's not only giving them the law that, hey, here's what you need to abide by, but let's give them tools and let's show them what it looks like. And let's give them the tool of how to make a report. And they are the eyes and ears. And the new Title IX regs actually require all school employees to be trained, and that they are, if they are aware of sexual harassment, that they have been provided notice, that that district has been provided notice. So for all schools now, every school employee needs to be trained, and not just trained on the regs, but again, how and how to make a report, And then lastly, what's working is record keeping or dissemination. So school districts that actually have a good record keeping system to keep track of what I call the breadcrumbs. So if you have one teacher that comes in and say, hey, something was off, another parent that comes in and says, hey, something was weird here, and then another student that comes in and says, this odd thing happened. And then all of a sudden, all those three odd things come together and you're doing an investigation. But without those pieces being put together, you don't have those pieces to know that something larger is going on. So those are the things: policies, guidance for the gray areas, leadership, training, and proper record keeping would be what I would recommend.
Thank you so much. Terri, did you have anything to add before I take a couple questions?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, sure. And so the first question, Adriana from New Zealand was asking about the culture. And so if you could just share that question, Adriana.
Oh my goodness, I've asked lots of questions and said lots of things, but what was the one that
how do we change the culture?
Oh, the culture, yes. So it comes down to the culture where it's not safe for teachers and to speak up, because when they do speak up, they're penalised or they're bullied or they're placed and, you know, micromanaged. I think that's something that really needs to be done, especially in New Zealand. It happens here. How is that happening in these over there? Does it happen over there where teachers speak out and they're penalised for speaking out?
Thank you, Adriana.
Yeah, I can speak to that. It definitely happens here. And it's definitely something that if there are reports, typically it's very divided in a community. We'll see support for the offender, support for the victim, and kind of a split community where people are siding with either side, and can be a lot of retaliation. And again, I think it comes down to having very clear guidance on what is acceptable and what's not. And the more we can define things like, hey, you can't hang out with a student one-on-one after school. You can't shut that door when you're meeting with that student. You can't give that student a ride home, and making it really clear what the boundaries are. Then it's not, well, you're just nitpicking about my performance, or you're just, I'm trying to help this person and be a coach to this person. Why are you giving me a hard time? And by having clear guidance around those boundaries, then it's no longer about, well, what does that person individually think? This is our school policy and we don't tolerate that behavior here. It doesn't matter what your intention are. It's just, we don't tolerate that behavior. And then having a leadership staff that's going to investigate it appropriately and have that tone that we don't tolerate it here. And it really, that communication piece is huge. Just a leadership team that is not afraid to say this word out loud, that it's going to happen in your school district. You need to talk about it and talk about how you're going to respond when it happens. So the more we can get information in the hands of our administrators, and that would be in the teacher prep programs, and Jeffrey Haverlin, who's on our board, is advocating for that we need to make sure teachers and administrators are prepared on how to handle this issue and how to talk about it. And right now it's not included in our teacher preparation programs across the US.
Right. And I just want to piggyback on that too, is that, you know, with regard to retaliation and fear of making a report, Adriana, here in the United States, mandated reporters are protected under most of the laws from retaliation. If they're making a report in good faith, you know, that without malice, they are protected from any kind of liabilities. And too often, again, they're not trained on that and they're not aware of that. Also here in the United States, Title IX also protects from retaliation against whistleblowers. And that means if it's a teacher making the report, if it's another school employee, if it's a parent, if it's a student, anyone that has made that report is supposed to be protected. Otherwise, it's a violation of their rights. So they do have recourse, you know, to file additional complaints if they are retaliated against. So these are the kinds of policies that and laws that can help. But again, it really does boil down to everybody having the understanding that if you don't make a report, you are leaving a child in harm's way. And it is your duty as a school employee to look out for the safety of those children, #1 priority. And you have to put, if you're a friend of the teacher in the classroom next door that you suspect is offending that child, it takes a great amount of courage to speak up. But we just hope that those teachers can muster that courage up and report and do the right thing for the child, because they're the only one that can help them at that point in time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have I think it's a related comment from Julie. So I'm going to unmute you, Julie. Just go ahead and accept that so you can ask your question.
Yes, hi, Terry. I actually spoke with you on the phone a few times. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. And
Julie.
Yeah.
Wow,
yeah.
it's nice to put a face.
Nice to see you, right. So I've got a twofold. I'm in a teacher prep program, special education, deaf education, sign language interpreting, but I'm also parenting a surviving daughter. And we've been fighting this district nonstop. And we have a clear, like crazy case, like so obvious 14 times that somebody tried to say something. And yet the appeals court just turned us down again in June because of this deliberate indifference standard, that because the school district, the administrators didn't actually see the rapes happening in the school during the lunch hour of my middle school daughter, they are not liable. And so my question is, how do we get at it? Because I keep thinking about Title IX, like there's got to be a phrase we could change there. Court case, I mean, people don't necessarily have the education that I have to, and the pure advocacy stubbornness to fight this. Families are exhausted. You know, you're dealing with so many things and whatever. So I want to know, how can we get that part? How do we address that? And I'm right on board with any research, any speaking, I'll do whatever, because we've got to get some of that addressed. And I will shut up now.
Thank you for sharing that, Julie.
To respond to your comment, deliberate indifference doesn't just have to be that they saw it. It can be that they responded with deliberate indifference by not having proper policies in place, by not training parents, students, and staff members, that they didn't respond appropriately to complaints or prior complaints. So deliberate indifference is actually much larger in that it's not just did they see it or witness it, it's did they have the right prevention, did they follow all the guidance that they're supposed to do with regard to best practices and meeting the laws. And so one thing that hopefully your attorney put in there is that, you know, reviewing, do they have the proper policies in place? Did they follow the right procedures? Did they have training? What was the training? Was it adequate enough? And all of those things would go into that and should be outlined for the appeals court.
Yeah.
Oh, Terry, did you want to respond to that one?
No, go. I think Billie-Jo covered it just perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to call on Judy. You had a couple questions. Go ahead.
Sorry, my internet connection's pretty unstable. So one is, and I understand absolutely the onus should be on adults. I was just asking about, you know, on the other side of supporting students and empowering them to report. And then also really curious about, you know, what the research or data shows around settings. So is self-contained special ed classroom kids at higher risk, kids sent to the smaller alternative schools where there's even less eyes on, and you know, I'm just curious about that in the research or data, because I think if we also added like the, you know, the use of seclusion, restraint, corporal punishment, which is still legal in Kentucky and being used in about 13 districts, you know, like all of that, it's pretty bad in those particular settings. I was
Thank you,
just
Terri.
wondering.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, special education students are one of the most vulnerable populations of students in schools. And one of the issues that we find with special ed is, again, they are isolated. They are in these, classrooms that are separated, sometimes even in a separate, building or mobile building, away from the general, population. So there is more opportunities for eyes and ears to be off those students. The other problem we have with special ed students is they're usually the students that are over the age of consent and even beyond the age of majority. So you will have students that are, over the age of 18 that have yet not graduated. And the way that laws read is, students are either protected up to the age of consent or they're protected just up to the age of majority in some criminal statutes, but they're not taking into account these special education students that are over those ages. So when it comes to trying to prosecute their offenders, they can't prosecute because of their age. So that's another issue we're trying to work on and trying to get some uniform legislation, criminal legislation and statutes that align with each other and that align with Title IX as well. So I hope that answers your question, but yeah, a lot more needs to be done.
Natalie, did you have anything to add on this question? If you're still here, I wasn't sure if you might have.
No, I'm definitely still here, but I think they've been doing an excellent
Okay.
job of answering them. I mean, you all.
Just from the student side, if you had any, no, okay.
No, I do want to just, one of the organizations that I was thinking for Julie, I think is Nonprofit Risk Management Center. I don't know if they're still doing a lot of work in this area, but they were several years ago. I'll look it up and put it in the chat, but definitely empathize with your case.
And I kind of wish that Laura was here, but one thing that we really advocate for in our work, and Laura's our education specialist, is social emotional learning curriculum, which is still not super widely adopted, and part of that being, knowing what your boundaries are and knowing how to talk about difficult topics, like your personal space or your private parts and that sort of thing. And so I think, those types of programs, although the onus, of course, should be on the adults in charge and all the policies there, but it's also, right, we want schools to be teaching children the types of skills that promote emotional resilience and good boundary setting and awareness of I think we do a really horrible job helping our children in this country understand power dynamics. I don't think I'm very good at understanding power dynamics as a result of my childhood. I don't think that I still am very good at understanding that. And it's just, all part of, or all could be a part of the social emotional learning package that's like just starting to get out there.
Can I jump in with something about
please.
Parents? I think that this is sorry.
Please.
I was thinking on one realm, but just like Billie-Jo and Terri have been talking about training for employees and volunteers and staff, all staff. I really think it's not. A lot of sexual abuse actually happens with very young children too. And so that's before a child even gets to school potentially. So doing a lot of, sexuality, but in a positive and talking about the negative, right? I think
Absolutely.
For parents understanding that their children need to know the names of their body parts and they need to know what, is okay and not okay to be touched and by whom, but then recognizing that it's not that child's fault by any means if something happens to them and that you just want them to come to you and then you will take care of it, like having it so that the guilt and the shame doesn't come in. But I do think parents need to get a lot better about talking about the good and the challenging parts of sexual health and the sexual risks of and sexual abuse. So all of it kind of together. And I think this is one of those balancing things that also has to happen. Not exactly, I'm just talking about balancing. You know, a lot of the positive childhood experiences are about relationships with adults, right? And so there's also that balance in education and youth serving organizations. Like, our kids have wonderful experiences with adults that really matter and that make a huge difference in their lives.
Right.
But you have to be balancing that risk too, right? So we don't want to, you know, eliminate any possibilities of one-on-one contact with adults that are not our child's, you know, but we also want to think about, for parents, what is it that you should be looking for, and what kind of things should be ringing that bell where you're like, oh, I don't know, this doesn't sound good, let me investigate more, or maybe I should be around during that. I mean, we need parents to also get on board so that they, and I put a couple organizations in the chat actually that I think have really tried to work on helping parents understand what they can be doing and when those alarm bells should be going off. And it's like, no, I shouldn't trust that person just because I think they're a great person, right? Like, you should still be kind of aware. So I guess I would just put that it is a lot of balancing. Does that make sense? I'm sorry,
yeah.
I was so thinking about like the Nonprofit Risk Management Center after Julie's story. I think I was not quite processing everything, but thank you.
Natalie,
I wanted to comment, if everyone can just stay just a couple minutes, we'll wrap up in probably about 5 minutes. So Terri, please respond.
Natalie, I just want to share with you, one of my favorite people in the whole world is a child psychologist and musician by the name of Peter Alsop. If you are having trouble speaking with your child about sensitive issues, go to peteralsop.com. I raised my children and taught in preschool and used his music, you know, my whole children's child. And he has songs such as My Body's Nobody's Body But Mine. And and so this is all about personal safety and your body. He also has another one, It's Only a Wee Wee, you know, so what's the big deal? You know, another song. So these types of childhood songs really, and this is why he wrote them, is to open up those lines of communications. Don't hug me too tight. You're squeezing me. You know, so it's this kind of thing, you know, that parents can just, you know, have fun in the car, you know, listen, because the music is just so captivating and so, my kids just loved it. And I still do. I still find myself humming those songs. But peteralsop.com is just great. Kids Safe Foundation is another great organization that does some child prevention. And then we have Dr. Glenn Lipson, a forensic psychologist on our board of advisors that has also developed the Making Right Choices training programs. And he has on there the True Yes, which is also another program for talking to children about these sensitive issues.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Billie-Jo and Terri if you have any closing words to wrap up. And then I invite you all to stay, just because this topic could be potentially triggering, to just stay for a few minutes, which won't be recorded, and we will just do some shaking out together if you would like. So Terri and Billie-Jo, any closing words?
Oh, I just want to thank you all for joining this webinar. Thank you for the opportunity, Alison. You know, to have this discussion. We need more of these, you know, types of discussions, and, you know, do what you can. Be parents, you're your child's best advocate. Speak up. The school does not own your children, you do. Your children are yours. And make sure that the environment is safe. Speak up, ask. You should be receiving training, ask for it if you have not. If you don't know about Title IX, you should know about Title IX, because they should be training you and informing you on it. Ask who the Title IX officer is. Be aware, educate yourself, and then educate your children. And go to SesameNet where you can find many, many resources to support you. We support survivors, we support friends and family, we support educators and legislators and all other professionals involved with this issue. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Terri, for joining.
Mhm.
Yeah, Terri said it all, but thank you for having us, and please reach out if there's anything we can do to support you all with research or prevalence or numbers to move things forward. We're here to help, and the more we can do to move the needle, which hasn't been moved very much in the time that we've been working on it, the more we can do to move it forward, the better. So thank you all for your partnership in advocacy.
Thank you so much, Billie-Jo. And one thing I didn't mention to you all is that Billie-Jo and I have been friends since 9th grade. We were in choir together, and it's really, really wonderful to know that I have this friend that's also an ally in this work that we're doing. And I'm just so grateful. And this has been such a nice opportunity to have you present, you know, the stuff that you've been working on, which I've been really curious about. So selfishly, I got to learn, you know, all about the work you're doing. And thank you for sharing it with the community at Paces Connection. And I hope you'll continue to share your work with us, because we're all super invested in this work as well. And we want to, you know, keep cheering you on and participating and partnering. So please, yeah, do post your progress.